Hi gardeners! Welcome to my vegetable garden here in West Central Florida. I have been growing vegetables in Florida for the past 11 years, and I mostly learned how to garden through trial and error, and with the emphasis on the errors. So today I'm going to talk about some of the lessons I learned the hard way, and hopefully you can learn from some of my mistakes and won't have to learn the same way I did. I started my first vegetable garden in the springtime. Like most people, I thought of spring as the perfect time to plant my seeds. So around the beginning of March, I bought a bunch of seeds and one of those Jiffy seed starter trays from my local Home Depot, and I planted all sorts of vegetables. I planted tomatoes and lettuce and carrots and green beans, collard greens, onions, bell peppers, squash, zucchini, a bunch of stuff. So all of my seeds sprouted and started growing, so I thought I was off to a good start. But little did I know that even though my plants were growing very happily in the beautiful March weather, some of them would not make it to harvest time before the heat of late April and May ruined them. I had no idea that some crops like carrots and lettuce and onions can't tolerate much heat. I assumed that all vegetables should be grown in the spring and summertime, and in fact I mistakenly assumed that being in sunny Florida would mean that I'd have an extra long growing season since we have such long summers. How wrong I was. I only got a few harvests out of that first season. Even my warm season vegetables struggled for a variety of reasons, which I will explain next. I think only my zucchini and squash and maybe my bell peppers did well that first year. So my first mistake was planting most of my crops too late in the season. Even the tomatoes didn't produce much of a usable crop. The tomatoes seemed to be doing really well, and they produced a bunch of green tomatoes by late June, but the intense heat of June and July caused them to never fully ripen. And then the bugs came, and the rains came, and the diseases came, and eventually the plants fizzled out and died, and I never did get much of a harvest. I think I just got a few green tomatoes that I brought inside to ripen after I realized that it was too hot for them to ripen outside. So my first tip is to plant seeds at the right time of year so that they can grow to maturity during their optimal growing conditions. Generally, we plant warm season crops in the late winter, early spring, and again in the early fall, and we plant cool season crops in the fall and winter. I've created other videos about what to plant during each month to help you figure out when the best seasons are for planting various types of vegetables. You can click on the link at the end of this video to view the planting guide videos. There are also a lot of charts you can find online, and I'll put links in the description below this video for some of the planting guides I use. I think it helps to think of the Florida growing season as starting in the fall instead of starting in the spring. We can start planting in the fall and continue growing our gardens through the winter and early spring. By late spring, it's getting too hot for most vegetables, so during summer, we only grow tropical crops and cover crops. So our off-season is the opposite of most other states. Northern gardeners take the winter off, but in Florida we take the summers off. Well, not only did I start my seeds too late in the season, but I also made the mistake of not giving my seedlings enough light. I had started my seeds indoors next to a west-facing window, which did not get enough direct sunlight. So the seedlings had to stretch out and reach for the light, and they ended up getting long, thin stems that were so weak and spindly that they would fall over. The word leggy is used to describe this problem. My lettuce was especially bad, And I had to start most of those first seedlings over in a new batch and put them outside where they would get more direct light. So the second lesson is to make sure to give seedlings plenty of light. If you're starting the seeds indoors, then one option is to put them in a south-facing window that gets 12 to 14 hours of bright light and turn them during the day so that they get an even amount of light on each side. Another option for starting seedlings indoors is to grow them under a grow light and put the lights just an inch or two higher than the seedlings and keep the light on for 12 or more hours. If you'd like to see the grow light setup I use, you can click the link at the end of this video. When I was finally ready to move my seedlings out into the garden, I made another terrible mistake. I had tender young green bean seedlings growing in pots near my house in a partially shaded area, and I had prepared an area out in the full sun in the garden, and I moved the pots one hot afternoon in May out into the garden in the full sun. And I had no idea that it would be such a rough transition for them to go from partial shade straight into the full sun. After moving them out into the blaring midday sun, I came back a few hours later to find them all wilted and burned looking. My next tip is don't suddenly move or transplant seedlings that were grown in a mild temperature into an extreme temperature. Expose them to hot or cold temperatures gradually to give them time to adjust. Seedlings that were started indoors or in a partially shaded location should be exposed gradually to full sun during hot weather because they can get fried if they're moved suddenly to a very hot, sunny location. On the flip side, seedlings that were started indoors or in a warm, protected location during the winter should be exposed gradually to cold temperatures. I also try to transplant my seedlings in the early evening when the weather is hot so that they have the maximum number of hours to get used to their transition before the intense midday sun and heat arrive. When the weather is cold, I do the opposite and transplant seedlings during the warmer part of the day. When I started my first garden, I bought a couple of truckloads of a garden soil blend from a local plant nursery, and I filled some raised beds with the soil blend, and then I added a sprinkling of some organic fertilizer, which it turns out had a very low NPK. The NPK numbers are the percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that the fertilizer has in it. Organic fertilizers usually have much smaller NPK amounts than synthetic fertilizers. These are the NPK numbers right here. So this one's got an NPK of 13, 13, 13. This is a synthetic fertilizer. This one has an NPK of 4, 4, 4. This is an organic fertilizer. And I think the organic fertilizer that I used back then had a very low NPK. It was probably something like 242 or something very low. The bag of fertilizer I had was pretty small, so my raised garden bed only got a light sprinkling of the fertilizer, and it was nowhere near enough. But I didn't have a clue at first. I thought that since I had just bought fresh garden soil, that it would have plenty of nutrients for my plants. And I thought one sprinkling of fertilizer in the beginning of the season would be enough. Wrong. My plants grew a little bit bigger, but then the growth slowed down and stalled, and it took me a ridiculously long time to figure out that I needed to give the plants more fertilizer. So my next tip is to make sure you give your plants plenty of fertilizer at planting time and at regular intervals throughout the growing season. Remember that if you're using an organic fertilizer, then you'll probably need to use more than you would of a synthetic fertilizer. You also don't want to go overboard and use too much because you can burn your plants. It's best to read the label of whatever fertilizer you're using and follow the usage directions. After I came to realize that my plants needed regular feedings of fertilizer, I started using a few different types of organic fertilizers to provide plenty of nutrients to my plants. In addition to using some organic granular fertilizer, I also started using this liquid fertilizer. It contains fish and seaweed. It's a great fertilizer and the plants love it, but I found out the hard way that it attracts some unwanted critters to the garden. I've had several experiences where I fertilized my plants with the fish fertilizer, and then the next day I found that something, probably raccoons, had been digging around the roots of my plants looking for the source of the fish smell. The worst time was when I fertilized some baby kale seedlings that I had just transplanted, and when I checked on them in the morning, some of them had actually been dug up and tossed aside. Thankfully, I was able to replant them and they were okay, but there's always a risk of having damage to the roots of the plants if something digs them up. Not only does the fish fertilizer attract digging animals, but it also attracts gnats. Adult fungus gnats like to lay their eggs in the moist soil, and the larvae can damage the plant roots. This is especially a problem with seedlings and young plants. If there are a lot of larvae chewing on the roots of the baby plants, it can stunt their growth and can even kill them. This is what happened to me. I had a tray of seedlings that I fertilized with a little fish fertilizer, and everything was fine for a while, but then suddenly, for no apparent reason, some of my seedlings started to die. The seedlings were planted in soil blocks, so I picked them up to inspect them, and I saw something glistening in the soil. It was hard to tell what it was, but when I looked very closely in the bright light, I realized that there were all these tiny translucent worm things all over the bottom of the soil blocks. I was able to get a toothpick and lift them out of the soil one by one. It took me over an hour to get them all out, but I was able to save some of my seedlings that weren't already too damaged. But unfortunately, I did still lose some of my seedlings to the fungus gnat larvae. So after those ordeals, I have learned that you really have to be careful when using fish fertilizer. It's a great fertilizer and I still use it, but I no longer use it on seedlings or new transplants since they're so vulnerable when they're small. When I use fish fertilizer in my garden, I use it in the morning, and then in the evening I come back and water it in to dilute any remaining smell. So far this has worked, and I haven't had any critters digging up the roots of my plants. Fish fertilizer seems to be the strongest attractor of critters, but I've seen it happen with other organic fertilizers too. I think blood meal and maybe bone meal are attractants as well. So when I fertilize with any strong-smelling organic fertilizer, I try to bury it enough to minimize the smell that attracts the critters. Over the next few years, my gardens gradually became more successful, but along the way, I still made quite a few mistakes. One thing that sticks out in my mind is when I first started growing sweet potatoes. I planted my sweet potatoes right next to my tomato and pepper plants. Well, my sweet potatoes grew great, and my tomato and pepper plants were growing good too, but I found out the hard way that sweet potatoes attract whiteflies. Well, whiteflies don't do much damage to sweet potatoes, but they can do some serious damage to tomato and pepper plants. And that's exactly what happened. I got a severe infestation of whiteflies on my tomato and pepper plants, and my plants started to decline. I suggest planting sweet potatoes in their own bed, away from tomatoes and peppers and other plants that can suffer damage from whiteflies. And besides attracting whiteflies, sweet potatoes can also take up a lot of space and sprawl all over the place. So if they're planted in a bed with other vegetables, they often take over the bed and choke out the other plants. So it's really best to give sweet potatoes their own space. Well, my first mistake was planting my sweet potatoes too close to my tomato and pepper plants. But to make matters even worse, I made another terrible mistake that almost killed my tomato and pepper plants. I bought some insecticidal soap, which will kill whiteflies when you spray it on them. Well, I must not have read the directions very closely, because I proceeded to spray my plants in the early afternoon on a hot day when the sun was out, and I didn't even do a test of a small area before I proceeded to spray it all over my plants. Well, a few hours later, I came back out to the garden to find my plants in horrible condition. My tomato and pepper plants were all wilty, and the leaves looked like they were covered in chemical burns. I immediately washed them off with water, but significant damage was already done. I don't think any of the plants actually died, and they eventually grew new leaves and somewhat recovered, but they were never as good as they were before I burned the leaves. The lesson here is to spray your plants in the early evening when the sun isn't so intense, and also to always spray a very small part of a few plants before drenching the whole garden in a spray that could potentially burn the leaves. I don't spray my plants with insecticidal soap very often, but when I do, I spray it in the late afternoon or early evening, and then I will usually rinse it off with water the next morning just to be safe. I couldn't spray my plants again for quite a long time since I had done so much damage to the leaves. So new batches of whiteflies kept infesting my plants throughout the rest of the growing season. I was trying to get rid of the whiteflies by cutting off and throwing away the most infested leaves. It sort of helped, but my plants were not in great shape. Pepper plants can live for years if they don't freeze during the winter time. And since I knew this, I was determined to save my pepper plants from the whiteflies and protect them through the winter so they would produce peppers again in the springtime. Well, after spending a bunch of time battling the whiteflies and trying to maintain some sickly looking plants that barely made it through the winter, I realized that I should have just destroyed the sickly, infested plants and thrown them all away along with the whiteflies. Instead, all I did was waste my time and kept the food source for the whiteflies so that they hung around and survived the winter. Then they were able to start infesting my newly planted seedlings in the spring. I learned from that experience that if you have sickly plants or severe pest infestations that are out of control, then it's best to remove the sickly plants and the pests that are infesting them so that you can stop the bugs and diseases from spreading to other healthy plants in the garden. I make every effort to control pests and to keep my plants healthy, but if I see that I'm in a losing battle, then I find it's better to cut my losses and not let the pests or diseases spread to new plants. Over the years, I've developed quite an obsession with growing different varieties of tomatoes. In the early years of my tomato growing trials, I would occasionally save some seeds from my tomato plants to plant during the next season. Well, when I planted the next batch of tomatoes from the seeds I saved, I didn't always get a tomato that was just like the parent that I saved the seeds from. Sometimes they were smaller or had a different shape, or sometimes the coloring would be different from the parent plant. This can happen for a couple of reasons. If you're growing a hybrid plant from saved seeds, then the successive generations of the same plant will not be the same as the parent plant because two different parent plants were intentionally crossed to produce the hybrid seed. You would have to buy more hybrid seeds to produce another hybrid plant. This is why a lot of people like to use heirloom seeds. They're not a hybrid, so if you save the seed from an heirloom plant, then the successive generations of plants planted from the saved seeds will be the same as the parent plant. However, if you're growing several varieties of the same species of plant right next to each other, then they can be cross-pollinated and they'll display characteristics of each of the varieties that were cross-pollinated. So they wouldn't have all of the same traits as the plant you saved seeds from. If you want to save seeds and have the next generation of plants match the characteristics of the plant you saved your seed from, then you need to use heirloom, not hybrid seeds, and you need to either space the different varieties of the same species far enough apart that they cannot be cross-pollinated, or else put up some type of physical barrier between them so that the pollinators can't pollinate different varieties with the pollen from the neighboring plants. If you're only growing one variety of a certain type of plant, then you wouldn't need to worry about spacing your plants apart. but if you're growing more than one variety and want to save the seeds, then it's something to keep in mind. There's one other thing I did in my first year of gardening that I would do differently in the future. It wasn't a huge problem, but I built my first raised bed to be a little too wide. This is my first raised bed behind me. It's 5 feet wide by 16 feet long. Well, the length is fine, but the width makes it a little hard for me to reach the center of the bed from either side. As you can see, it's hard for me to reach the middle from either side of this 5 foot wide bed. I have pretty long arms, but I still have to bend and twist really far in order to pull the weeds out of the center. And it's even harder to plant transplants than pulling weeds. It's not really good to walk on your garden soil because it causes soil compaction. But sometimes I have no choice but to crawl around in this bed while I'm planting seedlings, and I really don't like to do that. I'm constantly reminded of how I could have built my raised bed better, since my back gets extra sore anytime I work in this bed. So my last tip would be to keep the width of your raised beds 4 feet across or less, so that you can easily and comfortably reach the center of the bed without pressing down on the soil or straining your back. Well, hopefully my sad tales of gardening mishaps will help you to avoid making the same beginner mistakes that I did. Vegetable gardening in Florida is a lot of work, but once you get good at it, it's very rewarding. So don't give up if you have some failures. As with most things, you should just try to learn from your mistakes and not beat yourself up. I'm pretty sure that I've actually cried a few times because of some of my gardening failures. But they say that you learn more from your failures than your successes, and I do think that's true. So I may have learned the hard way, but I have learned a lot, and now my garden has many more successes than failures. I hope your gardens have more success than mine did in those early days. Happy gardening!